So I'm going to be presenting our paper today along with Will Hudgins and Michael Lynch. As David said, our paper is called Informal Learning Communities, the Other Massive Open Online Sea. So what we did was we studied informal learning communities to understand what some of the characteristics that make them tick are. So what makes a learning community considered informal? We defined it as a learning community where the learning happens democratically. So there's no one individual that dictates what everybody is going to learn. So even if there is like a tutorial or a teacher, the content that everybody's going to learn is reviewed and revised by multiple people with equal say. And the second property was that learning is not evaluated in any standardized way that's built into the platform or the system. And finally, learning is not certified with any kind of diploma that's intended to provide recognition outside of the community or the platform. So why study these communities? When we looked at these communities have a tendency to attract really massive, highly dedicated user bases. So when we looked at our language learning, for example, we found that there were over 240,000 subscribers for that subreddit, and over 15,000 of them were considered engaged. And we defined engaged as someone who had posted or who had responded to somebody else's post within the time frame we looked at. In comparison, a 2016 report on MIT and Harvard MOOC enrollment indicated that the median enrollment for their classes was 7,900, and the median number of engaged students was 1,500. So these communities have an ability to scale and reach far more people than the average MOOC. And so we wanted to know what features allow these communities to scale. We created a tag-based typology for identifying some of the different features that various informal online communities can have. So a tag in this case is simply identifies a feature or an attribute that applies to a different community. And then we divided those tags across 7 different categories, although a community could have multiple tags from a given category. So it is possible for a community to have, say, both forum-based interaction and Q&A-based interactions. And then we applied those tags across 62 different communities. And this chart here shows our the breakdown of how many tags were found for each, how many communities were found for each tag. It's worth noting that this is by no means a representative sample of informal online communities. So we would expect that as you add more types of communities, these would change. For example, you can see this dispersed tag here. That was the lowest frequency tag, but the real reason for that is that by nature, these types of communities are a little bit more difficult to find and therefore more difficult to study. And so in addition to applying our tags across 62 communities, we also performed 5 more in-depth case studies where we looked at how these tags played into, in more depth. So Mike Lynch is going to talk about those.
Yes, thanks, Ash. So the case studies that we did were deep dives into each of the, into some of the online communities that we found. We identified common and significant platform and social elements within each of the sites. So we were looking for what are the things that make this unique and what are the things that are shared. We noted how many members were in the community. We were looking at the scale of each community, thinking about using that for a filter. We captured specific features each community offered, gathered information about the size of the membership. Again, the size and how they communicated was critical. And then we measured activity levels of the community. So how many people were engaged? How was engagement? How did we measure engagement? So these are some of the tags, the top tags for the individual case study that we did for Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow is a question and answer site predominantly, but it does have other features, including critiques, private, et cetera, the things you see here. And so what we did with the discussions on Stack Overflow, there were askers and answers. So if you're familiar with Stack Overflow, what that means is someone poses a question and then you're able to comment or critique. Often the comments are used for critiquing the questions. And then there's an answer. Multiple contributors often have disagreements about which answer is the best or why it's a good idea to use one thing over another. Sometimes they build, so one answer would handle some aspects of the question, another would handle others. But we found that this back and forth between the users and the comments often added a great deal of content to the site that people could learn from. The community enforcement of the standards was also really important here. If you know about Stack Overflow, they have a reward system that unlocks moderator privileges. So as you use the site, ask questions and answer questions and become more familiar with the site and the rules of the community, you get more privileges. So this is both a reward for the users who are working through it, but it also creates the community and makes it such a wonderful community. So they maintain relevant, accurate, and positive site content for everyone. One thing to say about this is there's a light mechanism that if you ask a question that doesn't have a good, that's a poor question that's not answerable or too general, you might get a light touch from a comment or something from a user. But there's also a heavier mechanism where the moderators can remove your question from the site. And that gives you a lot of feedback, a lot of different kinds of feedback that allows you to learn. Another case study that we did was WikiHow, predominantly a tutorials-based website, but they also have a Q&A and they also have critiques. You know, there's many things that apply to many of these communities. So WikiHow is generally a way of creating how-to videos or how-to content for users to help them understand new and exciting things. Community members can teach and learn from each other by providing feedback on both the creation of the content as well as when they actually use the content, giving feedback back to the people who created it and the other people who are using it. And then there's a meta community here, which was really important, which is the behind the scenes community of registered users and moderators, the people who are sort of the authority figures on the site. They're not teachers specifically, but they're people who help maintain the community. And our final case study that we're talking about today is fanfiction.net, which is a very diverse community that focuses on improving writing, fiction writing predominantly. But the idea is you're going to be building skills, and the way that they do that is they'll publish some of their own writing, or they'll read other people's writing, their authors, and then they'll comment and critique on the work. So as you can imagine, that sort of community you know, does drive some interesting relationships. And this relationship is the key. So for this site, the most important thing is the users who might have some fear or apprehension about sharing their work can build a small group of people who will give them positive and helpful critiques and build a relationship over time. So this is something that we found on fanfiction.net that wasn't really on other sites. But really, we feel like this could have a real impact on the users' ability to learn, because they're going to share, they're going to build these communities, and they're going to feel comfortable doing so. So lastly, the building skills and consuming and creating, again, the authors are writing new content and the readers are able to review that content. So I'm going to hand it over to Will now to talk about some of our quantitative analytics.
Great. So we didn't just want to do some qualitative analysis, we also want to do quantitative analysis. And Reddit's awesome because they have a very powerful API that allows you to bulk collect data around different Reddit communities. So we collected metadata from the following Reddits listed below. Some of them are quite popular, like ask historians or answers. Some are real niche, like Dungeon Masters Academy. So it's a Dungeons and Dragons specific one. Some are very programming heavy, some are sports heavy. And we collected from these Reddit communities metadata about authors, posts, and so forth. So using this metadata, we calculate various metrics. So the first thing I kind of want to define is what's the engagement in the context of Reddit. And so we defined an engagement as creation of a new thread or response to an existing thread. And using those kind of definition, we calculate the following metrics: percent of engaged users, how many users have created or responded to a thread, percent of what we call exclusive responders, so those are people who respond to threads but never create threads, initiators, they create a thread, initiator responders, so those are people who've made at least one thread and responded in a thread they did not create. The idea of exclusive initiators, these are people who create threads but don't respond to threads. And then we also did some ratios. So how many engagements occur per registered member? What's the average engagement for every engaged user? And what's the number of average initiations per initiator? So the first thing we did is we want to kind of just look at the data and see if we could tell any contours from the data, if you will. So we split the subreddits using the critique and focus tags. We have a lot of other tags like Mike and Ash talked about, but because all the subreddits share one platform and format, they tended to be kind of uniform across the other tags. So we just looked at critique and focus. And what we found was if you sort and split the subreddits based off of their average engagements per engaged user, their engagements per registered member, their average their percent initiator responders, the top half is primarily focused, meaning these communities are on a focused subject such as volleyball or Dungeons and Dragons or learning machine learning. And we also saw a similar split with the critique tag for average engagements per engaged users and initiator responders, and a less noticeable split with the critique tag for engagements per registered members. So this is kind of descriptive metrics, if you will. They don't really tell you much about correlation or causation or anything, but we wanted to kind of just see the contours of the data. So based off of what we found when we looked at the data descriptively, we said, okay, maybe we should do some hypothesis testing to see if maybe there's any significant effects going on. So when we calculate correlations and p-values for these different metrics across the different tags, this is what our findings were. We found a significant main effect where there's a moderately strong correlation that focused communities tend to have a greater percentage of initiator responders. So those are people who create threads but also respond in threads. And then there was also a significant effect, although it was a weaker correlation, for average engagements per engaged users. So these results suggest that focused communities elicit more engagement than unfocused communities. So intuitively, maybe that makes sense. If you have a community like Learn Machine Learning or volleyball, these people are very passionate and interested in the subject, whereas a more general community like Ask Me, Explain Me Like I'm 5, or Ask Me Anything, those are general, so maybe they have less engagement. So with that said, we don't know if we really have time for questions, but happy to answer anything that people post in the chat, and so thankful for everybody listening to us.